The advertisement in the Denver Post had been running for 3 weeks when Clara Hartley finally gathered the courage to respond, her fingers trembling as she dipped her pen into ink that October evening in 1882. She never imagined that a mail-order bride advertisement would become her lifeline out of Philadelphia, away from the suffocating expectations of her aunt's boarding house, where every day felt like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small. The words flowed onto the paper with surprising ease, and she found herself writing not the practiced formalities she had rehearsed, but something raw and honest about longing for wide open spaces and a place where she could finally breathe. James Crawford received 73 letters in response to his advertisement, each one arriving at the post office in Silver Ridge, Colorado, tied with ribbon or sealed with wax. The postmaster had laughed, slapping him on the back, and saying he would have his pick of every eligible woman from the Mississippi to the Pacific. James had taken the bundle back to his ranch with a mixture of hope and dread, spreading them across his kitchen table under the light of an oil lamp. Most were perfectly pleasant, describing accomplishments and virtues, listing skills in cooking and sewing, mentioning family connections or education. He read them dutifully, one after another, until his eyes grew tired and the words began to blur together. Then he opened Clara's letter. It was longer than most, written in a slightly crooked hand that suggested she had been writing quickly, perhaps before she lost her nerve. She did not list her accomplishments first. Instead, she wrote about standing at her window in Philadelphia and watching the sunset paint the brick buildings gold, imagining what that same sun must look like setting over mountains she had never seen. She wrote about feeling like a bird in a cage that was slowly growing smaller, about dreams of riding a horse across open country with wind in her hair, about wanting to build something real with her own 2 hands instead of embroidering samplers that would hang on walls and gather dust. She wrote about her father, who had died when she was 15, and how he used to tell her stories about the West before her aunt had forbidden such talk as unladylike. At the end, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that she could read and write well, keep accounts, and had helped run her aunt's boarding house for 6 years, but she understood if he wanted someone more refined. James read that letter 3 times that first night. He set it aside, read through a dozen more responses, then picked Clara's up again. There was something in her words that resonated in his chest like a bell being struck. He had been in Colorado for 8 years, having left Missouri after his parents died of fever, and he had built his ranch from nothing into something respectable. He had cattle, good grazing land, a solid house with 4 rooms and a real wood floor. At 29, he was considered a catch by local standards, but every woman in Silver Ridge felt too familiar, too predictable. He wanted someone who understood what it meant to chase something bigger than yourself, to risk everything for the chance at belonging somewhere. He wrote back to Clara that same night, his response far longer than he had intended. He told her about his ranch, about the mountains that turned purple at dusk, about the clear cold streams and the way snow looked on pine trees in winter. He told her about building his house with his own hands, about the satisfaction of watching his herd grow year by year, about sitting on his porch in the evening and feeling both proud and lonely. He told her that he needed a partner, not just a housekeeper, someone who wanted to build a life rather than simply live one that was handed to them. He signed it simply James Crawford, sealed it, and rode into town the next morning to post it before he could reconsider. Clara's hands shook when she received his response 2 weeks later. She read it in her small attic room, sunlight streaming through the single window, and felt tears prick her eyes. He had understood. Somehow, this stranger in Colorado had read her clumsy words and understood exactly what she had been trying to say. She wrote back immediately, and thus began a correspondence that stretched over the next 6 weeks. They exchanged 5 more letters each, the words growing progressively more personal, more honest. James told her about losing his parents, about the loneliness of building something with no one to share it with. Clara wrote about her mother dying in childbirth when Clara was 10, about her father's slow decline afterward, about feeling invisible in her aunt's house where she was treated as free labor rather than family. In his 6th letter, James asked her to come to Colorado. He enclosed money for the train fare and told her that if she arrived and decided he was not what she wanted, he would pay for her return journey, no questions asked. Clara packed her few belongings into a worn carpet bag, left a brief note for her aunt, and boarded the train west with her heart hammering against her ribs. The journey took 4 days. Clara pressed her face to the window as the landscape transformed from crowded cities to farmland to plains that seemed to stretch forever under an endless sky. She watched buffalo in the distance, saw her first antelope, stared in wonder at mountains rising like giants on the horizon. Other passengers came and went, but Clara barely noticed them. She was traveling toward her future, toward a man she had never met but felt she knew through the vulnerability of written words. Silver Ridge was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a single main street with mountains rising dramatically in every direction. Clara stepped off the train with her carpetbag clutched in both hands, searching the platform for a man who matched James's description. Tall, he had written, with dark hair and a scar on his left hand from a knife that had slipped while working leather. She saw him immediately. He stood near the station house, hat in his hands, and even from a distance she could see the tension in his shoulders. He was scanning every passenger who disembarked, and when his eyes landed on her, something in his expression shifted. Recognition, perhaps, though they had never seen each other before. Or maybe just hope. Clara walked toward him, her legs unsteady after days on the train, and stopped a few feet away. They stared at each other for a long moment. He was handsome in a weathered way, with lines around his eyes from squinting into sun and wind, and there was kindness in his face that made her chest tighten with relief. "Miss Hartley." His voice was deeper than she had imagined, with a slight drawl that spoke of his Missouri roots. "Mr. Crawford." She managed a smile despite her nervousness. "I am glad you came." He twisted his hat in his hands, and she noticed the scar he had mentioned, a white line across his left palm. "The ride to the ranch is about an hour. I thought we could get some supper in town first if you are hungry. Give you a chance to rest. That would be nice." Clara's stomach was actually churning too much for food, but she appreciated the consideration, the chance to adjust before being taken to his isolated ranch. They went to a small restaurant where the proprietor clearly knew James well. Over stew and fresh bread, they talked carefully, both of them hyper-aware that their letters had created an intimacy that now had to be reconciled with physical reality. James asked about her journey, and she described the changing landscape. Clara asked about his ranch, and he told her about his cattle, his horses, the vegetables he struggled to grow in the rocky soil. "I have to know," Clara said finally, setting down her spoon and meeting his eyes. "You received dozens of letters. You told me that in your second response. Why did you choose mine? Many of them must have been from women more accomplished, more educated, more suitable." James was quiet for a moment, looking down at his own half-eaten meal. When he raised his eyes to hers, there was something vulnerable in his expression that made her breath catch. "I read every letter that came," he said slowly. "Some were very fine, very proper, women who could play piano and speak French and paint watercolors, but they felt like they were reciting a list of qualifications for a position. Then I read yours." He paused, his fingers drumming once on the table. "Your words felt like coming home. Like you understood something essential that most people never think about. You were not trying to convince me you were perfect. You were trying to tell me who you really were, what you really wanted. And what you wanted was what I wanted too. Not comfort or security or status, but belonging, a place to put down roots and grow something real." Clara felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "I was afraid I had written too much, been too honest. My aunt always said I spoke too freely. I am glad you did." James reached across the table and, after a moment's hesitation, placed his hand over hers. His palm was warm and calloused. I need honesty, Clara. Life out here is too hard for pretense. I need a partner who will tell me the truth, even when it is difficult. She turned her hand over, letting her fingers curl around his. I can do that. They finished their meal and James helped her up into his wagon, her carpetbag stowed in the back. The ride to his ranch took them out of town and into rolling countryside, where cattle grazed and mountains loomed ever closer. The late afternoon sun painted everything gold and orange, and Clara found herself thinking of all those sunsets she had watched through her narrow window in Philadelphia. This was so much bigger, so much more alive. The ranch house came into view as they crested a hill. It was built of wood with a stone chimney, larger than Clara had expected, with a porch that wrapped around two sides and real glass windows that caught the dying light. A barn stood nearby, solid and well-maintained, and she could see cattle in the distance, horses in a corral. You built all this yourself? Clara asked, awed. I had help with the barn raising, and neighbors helped with the house frame, but most of it, yes. James pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. It is not fancy, but it is sturdy, and it is paid for, every inch of it. He helped her down and carried her bag inside. The interior was sparse but clean, with furniture that was clearly handmade but well-crafted. There was a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area with a real iron stove, and 2 bedrooms. James showed her to the smaller bedroom, setting her bag on the bed. I thought you might want your own space, he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. Until we know each other better. Until you are sure. Clara looked around the room. It had a real bed with a quilt, a dresser, a window that looked out toward the mountains. It was more than she had expected, more consideration than she had dared hope for. Thank you, she said softly. That is very kind. They had supper together in the fading light, and James told her more about the ranch, about the work that would need doing as winter approached, about the neighbors scattered across the valley who helped each other during hard times. Clara listened, asking questions, and found herself relaxing incrementally. This man was genuine, she realized. Everything he had written in his letters was true. He was lonely and hardworking and hopeful, and he wanted someone to share his life with, not someone to serve him. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Clara listened to the absolute silence of the countryside. No city noises, no sounds of other boarders moving in nearby rooms, just wind and the distant call of some night bird. She had taken an enormous risk coming here, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The next weeks established a rhythm. Clara woke early and learned the routines of the ranch. James was patient, showing her how to milk the cow, how to feed the chickens, how to manage the stove that heated more efficiently than any she had used in Philadelphia. She proved her competence with cooking and mending, but also surprised him by wanting to learn ranch work. She asked to learn about the cattle, about reading the weather, about fixing tack and mending fence. Most women would not want to do this kind of work, James said one afternoon as he showed her how to properly hammer a fence post. I am not most women. Clara wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of dirt. Besides, if this is going to be my home, I want to understand all of it, not just the house. He smiled at that, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made him look younger. Fair enough. They talked while they worked, continuing the conversations that had begun in their letters but expanding them with daily life. Clara learned that James loved to read but had few books, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, that he sang quietly to himself while doing chores. James learned that Clara had a quick mind for numbers and could calculate yields and expenses faster than he could, that she was stubborn when she believed she was right, that she laughed with her whole body when something truly amused her. The physical attraction grew alongside the friendship. Clara found herself noticing the strength in James's hands, the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders when he lifted something heavy. James caught himself staring at Clara when she was focused on some task, admiring the determination in her expression. The way escaped strands of hair curled at her neck. They were careful with each other, respectful of the boundaries they had established, but the awareness hummed between them like a plucked string. 6 weeks after Clara's arrival, the first major snow came. They had been preparing for it, stocking supplies and securing the animals, but the storm was fiercer than James had anticipated. Snow fell for 2 days straight, piling in drifts against the house and barn. They were trapped inside together, keeping the fire going, rationing their activities to conserve energy. On the second night, sitting by the fireplace with the wind howling outside, James finally voiced what had been building between them. "Clara, I need to know what you are thinking." He stared into the fire, his profile sharp in the flickering light. "You have been here almost 2 months. You know what life is like here now, what you would be taking on. I do not want to pressure you, but I also cannot keep living in this uncertainty." Clara's heart raced. She had been wrestling with the same question, knowing that a decision needed to be made but afraid of making it. "What are you asking me, James?" He turned to look at her directly. "I am asking if you will marry me, if you will stay here permanently as my wife, as my partner in building this life. I know it is not what you might have had back east. I know I cannot offer you fancy things or easy days, but I can offer you honesty and hard work and everything I have built, and I can offer you myself for whatever that is worth." She saw the vulnerability in his face, the fear of rejection that he was trying to hide. This strong, capable man was afraid she would say no, that she would leave him alone again. "Can I tell you something?" Clara asked quietly. "When I was a little girl, before my mother died, she used to say that home is not a place, it is a feeling. She said you know you are home when you can be completely yourself and still feel safe. I never understood what she meant until now." She reached over and took his hand. "Your words in that first letter felt like coming home. And being here with you, learning this life, building something together, that feels like home too. So yes, James Crawford, I will marry you." The kiss that followed was tentative at first, both of them uncertain, then deeper as 8 weeks of restrained attraction finally found release. His arms came around her, and she leaned into his strength, into the solid reality of him. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "We will do this properly," he said, his voice rough. "I will ride into town as soon as the storm clears and arrange for the circuit preacher to come out. We will be married right with witnesses." "I do not need anything fancy," Clara said. "I just need you." The storm cleared the next morning, leaving the world transformed into white silence. James rode into Silver Ridge and returned with news that the circuit preacher would arrive in 4 days. Clara used that time to take apart one of her 2 dresses and remake it into something more appropriate for a wedding, simple but clean. She had no veil, no flowers in November, but she did not care. The day of the wedding was cold but brilliantly clear. The preacher arrived along with 3 neighboring families who had made the journey to witness the ceremony. Clara stood in the main room of the house that would now legally be her home, wearing her remade dress, and listened to James speak his vows in that deep, steady voice. When it was her turn, she looked into his eyes and promised to be his partner, his helpmate, his companion through whatever came. The neighbors stayed for a simple meal, offering congratulations and advice with the easy familiarity of frontier life where everyone depended on everyone else. An older woman named Mrs. Patterson pulled Clara aside and squeezed her hand. "I have known James Crawford since he first came to this valley," she said. "He is a good man, honest and hardworking. You could do far worse, but I can see he chose well too. You have steel in you, girl. You will need it out here." When the guests finally left and they were alone, night falling fast around the ranch, James and Clara stood together in the main room. The fire crackled in the hearth and the lamplight made everything warm and golden. "Are you nervous?" James asked quietly, his hand finding hers. "Yes," Clara admitted, "but not about you, about whether I can be everything you need." He turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to cup her face gently. You already are. You came all this way on faith. You learned everything I could teach you and asked for more. You made this house feel like a home instead of just a place I sleep. You are exactly what I need, Clara Crawford. Hearing her new name sent a shiver through her. Say it again. Clara Crawford, he repeated, smiling. My wife. She rose on her toes to kiss him, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back. He lifted her easily and carried her to his bedroom, which was now their bedroom, and they came together with a mixture of tenderness and passion that left them both breathless and amazed. Later, lying tangled together in the darkness, Clara traced the scar on his palm. Tell me how you really got this. I told you, a knife slipped while I was working leather. Yes, but you did not tell me the story, James laughed quietly. All right. I was 19 and thought I was more skilled than I actually was. I was trying to make a saddle, my first one, and I was cutting the leather with a knife that was far too sharp. My hand slipped, and the blade went right across my palm. I bled all over the leather and ruined it completely. I had to ride into town and have the doctor sew it up with 12 stitches. The saddle leather was a total loss and I was out 3 months of saved wages. I learned 2 lessons that day. Respect your tools and do not let pride make you careless. Clara kissed the scar. I like it. It is part of your story. And what about you? His fingers found a small scar on her shoulder. What is this from? I was 14 and trying to prove I could climb the tree outside my aunt's boarding house as well as any of the boys in the neighborhood. I made it to the top branch before it cracked and I fell. Landed on a broken piece of fence. My father was so angry, but not because I was hurt, because my aunt had scolded me for being unladylike and he hated seeing her try to crush my spirit. He sounds like he was a good man. He was. I think he would have liked you. They talked deep into the night, sharing stories and secrets, learning each other's bodies and histories with equal curiosity. By the time they finally fell asleep, Clara felt like some fundamental piece of herself had clicked into place. Winter deepened and they settled into married life. The work was relentless but satisfying. They repaired equipment, cared for the animals through brutal cold snaps, kept the house warm and the food stores managed. Clara proved to have a gift for organization, establishing systems for everything from feed schedules to expense tracking. James taught her to shoot so she could protect herself if needed, and she turned out to be a natural markswoman, her steady hands and sharp eyes making her more accurate than he was. Where did you learn to focus like that? He asked after she hit 5 targets in a row. Embroidery, she said with a wry smile. 6 years of forcing myself to concentrate on tiny, tedious stitches. I suppose it was good for something after all. They laughed together more and more often. James's dry humor emerged fully, and Clara discovered she loved making him laugh, loved the way his whole face changed when he was genuinely amused. They worked side by side during the day and came together at night, and Clara understood for the first time what marriage could be when it was built on genuine partnership. Spring arrived slowly, snow melting to reveal muddy ground and the first hints of green. With the thaw came the hard work of calving season. Clara worked alongside James, learning to assist with difficult births, to bottle feed orphaned calves, to recognize signs of illness. She was exhausted every night, falling into bed with aching muscles, but she had never felt more alive. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, James pulled her close against his side. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Leaving Philadelphia, coming out here?" Clara thought about her aunt's boarding house with its narrow rooms and narrower expectations, about the life she would have had if she had never answered that advertisement. Then she looked at the land spreading before them, at the house they shared, at the man whose arm was warm around her shoulders. "Not for a single moment," she said. "Do you regret choosing my letter?" He kissed the top of her head. "Choosing you was the smartest thing I have ever done. You turned a house into a home and a dream into a life. We did it together," Clara corrected. "That is what partnership means." Summer brought longer days and the backbreaking work of haying. Clara learned to swing a scythe, to stack hay in the barn, to read the sky for signs of rain that could ruin a cut field. She also discovered she was pregnant in early June, her monthly courses stopping and her breasts becoming tender. She waited to tell James until she was certain, then broke the news one morning over breakfast. He stared at her, coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. A baby. Yes, by my calculations, sometime in late January or early February. The cup clattered to the table and he was around to her side in 3 strides, pulling her up into his arms. A baby, we are going to have a baby. Clara laughed at his wonder, at the joy in his face. Are you pleased? Pleased, Clara, I am amazed, I am terrified. I am the happiest I have ever been. He kissed her thoroughly, then pulled back with sudden concern. Should you be doing heavy work? Should you rest more? I am pregnant, not fragile. Women have been having babies and doing work forever. I will be sensible, I promise, but I am not going to spend 7 months lying in bed. He worried anyway, watching her constantly for signs of fatigue, trying to take on more of the heavy work himself. Clara was touched by his concern even as she insisted on maintaining her routines. Mrs. Patterson came to visit when word spread, bringing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. First one is always the hardest, she said cheerfully. But you are strong and young, you will do fine. Just make sure James boils plenty of water and keeps his head when the time comes. Summer faded into fall and Clara's belly grew round. She adjusted her dresses, let out seams, and continued working as long as she was able. James built a cradle in the evenings, sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk, carving designs into the headboard. Clara sewed blankets and tiny gowns, her hands remembering skills she had resented learning but was now grateful to possess. They talked about names, debated options, argued good-naturedly. If a boy, James wanted to name him after Clara's father. If a girl, Clara wanted to use James's mother's name. They finally agreed to wait until the baby arrived to decide. Winter returned and Clara grew more uncomfortable, her body awkward and ungainly. James helped her with everything from putting on shoes to rising from chairs, his patience infinite. On a bitter cold night in late January, her pains started just after supper. James rode immediately to fetch Mrs. Patterson, who lived closest and had midwifed half the babies in the county. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day. James paced, boiled water, brought Clara cold cloths for her forehead, held her hand when the pains were at their worst. Mrs. Patterson was calm and competent, offering encouragement and checking Clara's progress with experienced hands. Finally, as afternoon light slanted through the window, their son was born. He came into the world screaming his outrage, red-faced and perfect. Mrs. Patterson cleaned him, wrapped him in a blanket, and placed him in Clara's arms while James stared in absolute wonder. "You did it," he whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed and putting his arm around Clara. "He is perfect. He is loud," Clara said, but she was smiling through her exhaustion. "What should we name him?" James touched the baby's tiny hand, watching the miniature fingers curl around his much larger one. "Thomas, after your father, if that is still all right with you." "Thomas Crawford." Clara looked down at her son, at his eyes squinting against the light at the dark fuzz on his head. "Yes." "That is exactly right." Mrs. Patterson stayed for 3 days, helping Clara learn to nurse, showing her how to care for the baby, making sure there were no complications. When she finally left, Clara and James were alone with their son, terrified and exhilarated by the responsibility. Those first weeks were exhausting. Thomas woke every few hours to feed, and Clara walked the floors with him at night when he was fussy. James helped whenever he could, changing soiled cloths, rocking the baby so Clara could snatch a few hours of sleep, taking over the cooking and cleaning without complaint. They were both bleary-eyed and tired, but there was joy too, watching Thomas grow and change, seeing his first real smiles, hearing his delighted coos. "I never knew I could love someone this much," James said one night, holding his sleeping son against his chest. I thought I understood love when I married you, but this is different. This is terrifying." "I know," Clara agreed, leaning against his side. "Every moment I am afraid something will happen to him, that I will do something wrong. But then he looks at me and smiles, and I think maybe we can actually do this." "We can," James said firmly. "We are doing it, together." Spring came again, and Thomas grew stronger, more alert. Clara gradually returned to her routines, though now she wore the baby in a sling while she worked, or set him on a blanket nearby where she could watch him. James was a devoted father, playing with Thomas whenever he had a free moment, talking to him constantly as if the baby understood every word. The ranch continued to thrive. The herd had grown and they were able to sell cattle for a good profit. James used some of the money to buy more land and some to order books from back east, including several Clara had mentioned wanting to read. They sat together in the evenings, Clara reading aloud while James held Thomas or worked on some project, and the house felt full of contentment. When Thomas was 6 months old, they took him to town for the first time. The trip was an adventure, with Clara anxious about every jolt of the wagon, but the baby seemed to enjoy the motion. In Silver Ridge, people crowded around to see the newest addition to the valley, and Clara felt a warmth of community she had never experienced in Philadelphia's boarding houses. "You have made something real here," Mrs. Patterson said, watching James bounce Thomas on his knee while Clara shopped for supplies. "A real family, a real life. Not everyone can do that. We were lucky," Clara said. "Luck had less to do with it than you might think. You both were willing to take a risk, to be honest with each other. That matters more than luck." As Thomas grew into a toddler, curious and active, Clara and James discussed having more children. They both wanted a large family, wanted the house to be full of life and noise. Clara became pregnant again when Thomas was 18 months old, and this time the process felt less frightening, more familiar. Their daughter, Elizabeth, was born on a warm May morning, arriving much faster than her brother had. She was quieter than Thomas had been, observing the world with serious blue eyes. "She looks like you," James told Clara, touching the baby's soft cheek. "She has your expression when you are thinking hard about something." Life settled into a new rhythm with 2 children. Thomas was old enough to be both helpful and mischievous, and Elizabeth was an easy baby who seemed content to watch her brother's antics. Clara managed the household and the children with the same organizational skills she had brought to the ranch accounts, and James continued to build their holdings, adding improvements each year. They had hard times too. A harsh winter killed some cattle and they had to tighten their belts. A summer drought made the grass sparse, and they worried constantly about water. Thomas fell and broke his arm when he was 4, and Clara spent 3 terrifying hours riding to town with him while James stayed with Elizabeth. But they faced each challenge together, supporting each other, and came through stronger. On their 5th wedding anniversary, James gave Clara a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a leather-bound journal with blank pages. "I thought you might want to write," he said. "You always had such a gift for words. That first letter you sent me, I still have it. I keep it in my desk drawer and sometimes I take it out and read it again, remembering how it made me feel." Clara ran her hands over the smooth leather, thinking of all the words she had written in her life, but especially those that had brought her here. "What should I write about?" "Whatever you want. Your thoughts, your days, stories for the children when they are older. Anything." She started writing that night after the children were asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with lamplight pooling around her. She wrote about the journey that had brought her from Philadelphia to Colorado, about reading James's advertisement and taking the terrifying risk of responding. She wrote about their correspondence, about the day she arrived in Silver Ridge, about falling in love slowly and then all at once. She wrote about building a life together, about their children, about the ranch that had become her home in every sense of the word. The years continued to pass. Thomas grew tall and serious, fascinated by the cattle and the land. Elizabeth was quieter but equally curious, always asking questions about how things worked. They had a third child, another son they named Samuel, and Clara joked that their house was going to burst at the seams. "We could add on," James suggested. "Another bedroom, maybe enlarge the main room." They worked on the additions together, James doing the heavy construction while Clara planned the layout and finished the interiors. The house grew along with their family, each new room a testament to what they had built together. When Thomas was 12, old enough to be truly helpful with ranch work, he asked his father about the advertisement that had brought Clara to Colorado. "Pa, some of the boys in town were talking about mail-order brides," he said one evening. "They said Ma came here to marry you without ever meeting you first. Is that true?" James glanced at Clara, who was mending by the fire. She nodded slightly, indicating he should answer honestly. "It is true," James said. "I placed an advertisement in a Denver newspaper because I wanted a wife, but there were not many prospects in Silver Ridge. I received a lot of responses, but your mother's letter was different. It stood out." "Why?" Elizabeth asked, looking up from the book she was reading. At 9, she was endlessly curious about everything. Clara set down her mending. "Why don't you tell them the story properly, the whole thing?" So James told his children about the 73 letters, about reading through them one by one and feeling nothing but polite interest. He told them about opening Clara's letter and feeling something shift in his chest, like recognizing something he had been searching for without knowing it. He described their correspondence, the risk Clara took in coming west, their careful courtship after she arrived. "But how did you know?" Thomas persisted. "How did you know Ma's letter was the right one?" James looked at Clara across the room, their eyes meeting with the understanding of 15 years together. "Her words felt like coming home," he said simply. "Like she understood something essential about what I wanted from life, what I needed. And I hoped I might be able to give her the same thing." "And did he?" Elizabeth asked Clara. Clara smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, he did. We gave each other a home, a real home, not just a building but a place where we both belong." Samuel, only 5, did not fully understand the conversation, but he climbed into his mother's lap anyway. Content, just to be close. Clara held him and watched her family, thinking about that terrified girl who had boarded a train with nothing but a carpetbag and hope. When the children were in bed, Clara and James sat on the porch as they often did, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The night air was cool and filled with the sounds of animals settling, the distant call of coyotes, the rustle of wind through grass. "Do you remember what you wrote in that first letter?" James asked. "About wanting to build something real with your own hands." "I remember every word of that letter," Clara said. "I was so nervous sending it. I thought you would think I was too forward, too strange." "I thought you were honest," James said, "and brave. It takes courage to write what you really feel instead of what you think someone wants to hear." He reached over and took her hand. "I am glad you had that courage. I am glad you chose to answer my advertisement out of all the ones you must have seen." "Yours was the only one I answered," Clara admitted. "Something about the way you worded it, the things you emphasized. You were not looking for a servant or an ornament. You wanted a partner." That was what I needed to hear. They sat in comfortable silence, fingers intertwined, looking out over the land they had built together. The ranch was prosperous now, the house was full of children, and they had carved out a life that satisfied something deep in both of them. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been if you had stayed in Philadelphia?" James asked. Clara considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. I suppose I would have eventually married someone my aunt approved of, someone safe and proper. I would have had a predictable life in a predictable place. I might even have been content in a way." She squeezed his hand. "But I would never have known what this feels like. This sense of having built something meaningful, of being exactly where I am supposed to be with exactly who I am supposed to be with. I would have survived, but I would not have truly lived." "That is exactly how I felt before you came," James said quietly. "I had built the ranch, I had material success, but something was missing. I was surviving, not living. You changed that." The years continued their steady march. Thomas took over more of the ranch responsibilities as he grew into a young man, showing his father's steady competence and his mother's organizational mind. Elizabeth developed a love for reading and learning, and Clara taught her everything she could, wishing she could give her daughter more formal education than was available in Silver Ridge. Samuel was the wild one, always climbing trees and chasing adventures, giving his parents constant heart palpitations. They weathered droughts and hard winters, celebrated good years, helped neighbors, and were helped in turn. The community around Silver Ridge grew and changed, and they were part of it, their family woven into the fabric of the place. Clara never forgot where she had come from or the leap of faith that had brought her here, and she made sure her children understood the value of courage and honesty. When Clara was 40, James surprised her by taking her on a trip to Denver, their first real time away from the ranch together since they had married. They left the children with the Pattersons and rode the train into the city, staying in a hotel and walking the streets like tourists. James took her to a bookstore and told her to choose whatever she wanted, and Clara selected a dozen volumes, running her hands over the spines with delight. "You remember the first time we had dinner together?" Clara asked one evening as they dined in a restaurant far finer than anything in Silver Ridge. "Right after I arrived, when we were both so nervous we could barely eat. I remember thinking you were even prettier than I had imagined," James said. "And I remember being terrified you would decide I was not what you wanted and take the next train back east." "I remember thinking the same thing about you," Clara admitted. "That I had taken this enormous risk, and what if it did not work out? What if we were completely incompatible in person?" "But we were not." "No," Clara agreed, smiling. "We were not." They returned to the ranch after a week, both glad for the break but also happy to be home. The children had managed well, with Thomas proving he could handle the responsibility and Elizabeth keeping Samuel out of too much trouble. The house felt right again once they were all together, full and noisy and alive. As their children grew older and began making their own way in the world, Clara and James found themselves with more time alone together. Thomas eventually married a young woman from a neighboring ranch, a practical girl who reminded Clara of herself at that age. They built a house on the western portion of the Crawford land and started their own herd. Elizabeth surprised everyone by announcing she wanted to become a teacher, and Clara and James supported her decision, helping her get the training she needed. Samuel, true to his adventurous nature, talked about seeing more of the West before settling down. "We raised them to be independent," James said when Clara worried about them scattering. "We raised them to make their own choices. We cannot be upset when they do exactly that." "I know," Clara sighed. "I just miss having them all under one roof." "We will always be their home," James assured her, "just like this place became ours." On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch. Thomas came with his wife and their 2 young children. Elizabeth traveled from the town where she taught school. Samuel arrived with stories of his adventures working on cattle drives and exploring new territories. The house was full of life and noise and love, exactly as Clara had always dreamed it would be. That evening, after the younger children were asleep and the adults were sitting around the table with coffee, Thomas asked his father the question again, the one he had asked as a boy. "Pa, I have been thinking about that story you told us years ago, about Ma's letter. You said it felt like coming home. I think I understand that better now, being married myself. But what I want to know is, did you ever have doubts? Did you ever worry you had made the wrong choice?" James looked at Clara, his wife of 25 years, the mother of his children, his partner in building a life. Her hair had threads of silver now and there were lines around her eyes, but she was still the woman who had written those honest, brave words so many years ago. "Not once," he said firmly. "Not for a single moment. Your mother and I built something real together, something that has lasted through hard times and good. We built it on honesty and trust and hard work, and that foundation has never wavered." Choosing her letter, convincing her to take a chance on me, that was the best decision I ever made." Clara reached across the table and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "We chose each other," she said, "and we keep choosing each other every day. That is what makes it work." Their children watched them with varying expressions of understanding, seeing in their parents' partnership something to aspire to in their own lives. The evening wound down eventually, with Thomas's family heading to their own house and Elizabeth and Samuel retiring to their old bedrooms. Clara and James sat on the porch, as they had done thousands of times over the years, watching the stars emerge in the vast Colorado sky. The night was cool and clear, and in the distance they could hear cattle lowing and the wind moving through the grass. 25 years, Clara said softly. "Sometimes it feels like we just met, and sometimes it feels like we have been together forever." "Both things are true," James said, his arm coming around her shoulders. "We have grown together, changed together. We are not the same people who met on that train platform, but we are still us. Still the same essential thing that recognized each other in those letters." "Do you ever wonder what happened to the other women who wrote to you?" Clara asked curiously. "The 72 other letters, sometimes," James admitted. "I hope they found what they were looking for, whatever that was. But mostly I just feel grateful that your letter happened to be in that stack, that I happened to open it when I did, that everything aligned just right." "It was not just luck," Clara said, echoing what Mrs. Patterson had told her years ago. "We both were willing to take a risk, to be honest, to work at building something together. That matters more than luck." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had learned each other's rhythms so thoroughly that words were often unnecessary. The ranch spread around them in the darkness, every inch of it shaped by their labor and their vision. Inside the house, their children slept under the roof that James had built and Clara had made into a home. It was exactly what they had both been searching for when they wrote those letters so many years ago. A place to belong, a person to belong with, and a life built on something real and true. As they finally rose to head inside, Clara paused and looked back at the mountains silhouetted against the stars. She thought about that girl on the train, pressing her face to the window and traveling toward an unknown future. She thought about the courage it had taken to write that letter, to admit her real dreams instead of hiding them. She thought about James reading her words and recognizing something essential, something that spoke to his own deepest needs. "Your words felt like coming home," he had told her, and she had understood exactly what he meant because his words had done the same for her. They had found each other through honesty and courage, and they had built something that would last, something that would outlive them in the children they raised and the land they had tended. Clara took James's hand, and they walked into the house together, closing the door on the night and on the long, winding journey that had brought them both home.